South Africa ended apartheid 30 years ago. Has there been progress over the past 3 decades? And what are the challenges ahead? Hello, I'm Naidoo, and this is The Heat. South Africa marks 30 years of democracy. On April 26, 1994, the country closed the door on apartheid and entered a new era under President Nelson Mandela. But the cracks have been showing for some time, with mounting challenges such as unemployment, poverty, crime, and weak economic growth. We begin with this report from CGTN's Julie Shire in Cape Town.
1994 changed the course of South Africa's history as a new era of democracy began with President Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress won the first democratic elections. Duduzile Hadebe put her life on the line in 1976 for a just education during the Soweto uprisings. She was beaming with pride as the first multiracial election took place.
We are very happy if when we want to go to the election, that election will make change in South Africa, freedom, that we call freedom.
Hadebe was among millions of hopeful South Africans who voted for a better future. But those hopes have dwindled over the last 30 years.
You don't have a freedom without economy. You can't drive a car without petrol. For example, petrol is increasing every day. And if the petrol is increasing every day, also the food going up. Everything is going up. And most of the people, they are not working.
Duduzile lives in Lawley Township. A lack of investment and big industry here has limited opportunity.
I feel heavy because there's no jobs, there's no resources, there's no stuff. But then I still have hope that things will change, you know. Things will change. Things we'll get through this. It will get better for us all.
Many feel the ruling party delivered empty promises.
We need a lot of things. We need houses, we need water, we need electricity, we need a lot of issues to be solved.
We need to be able to go and feed ourselves. We need to be able to do things for ourselves, you know, as young people or even in middle age, you know, we are most suffering.
Democracy has given South Africans a voice and allowed them to live freely. There's also been significant progress in addressing service delivery and housing needs, but more needs to be done to reduce challenges such as unemployment, poverty and crime, which affects millions of South Africans every day. Julie Shire, CGTN, Cape Town.
To discuss the situation in South Africa, let's bring in our panelists. Here in the studio, Kenneth Mwenda is an extraordinary professor of law at the University of the Western Cape. From Cape Town, Ebrahim Rasool is a former South African ambassador to the United States. Lawson Naidoo is the executive secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. And Nhlanhla Sehume is a journalist and news anchor. He joins us from Johannesburg in South Africa. Welcome to all of you. Ambassador, let me start with you. You played a key role in that fight against apartheid. You went to prison for that. After 1994, you served in government as Premier of the Western Cape. And as I mentioned, you were also the South African ambassador to the United States. What is your assessment of the country 30 years after the end of apartheid?
I really feel that we have not achieved everything, that we even have reason to feel somewhat disappointed, that we have not reached our full potential. But I think that there are sufficient indicators to say that life 30 years after apartheid is infinitely, particularly the peace of South Africa, than they were. And so if you look at what are some of those indicators that we are talking about, I think we speak about life expectancy that has grown from 52 to 65. I think we speak about social security, where every month 23 million people have something that keeps the wolves away from the door. I think we have enough to show that life has improved, the education, the health services, and so forth. But I think we have a reason to feel somewhat disappointed that the full promise of 1994 has not been achieved.
Lawson, great to see you. That period just before that historic election in 1994, that was a turbulent time in South Africa. The first constitutional conference collapsed. There was a second conference, which did produce the constitution. But just before the election, one of the country's major parties, Inkatha, threatened to boycott the election. And that could have put a very big question mark over the legitimacy of the process. But in the end, a deal was reached. The election did take place. And despite the country's considerable economic and security problems that we see these days, would it be fair to say that what happened more than 30 years ago has given rise to what is a very robust and vibrant democracy in South Africa?
Indeed, Anand, good to chat to you again. Look, I think we certainly have a vibrant democracy in South Africa. It's a very loud, noisy democracy. There are lots of voices that we hear. We've got elections coming up next month, and there are a record number of political parties and independent candidates contesting those elections. So in terms of those sort of broad democratic norms, we've kind of done well. But I think, picking up on the point that Ambassador Rasool was talking about, I would go further and say that, in the first 10 years, I think there was a significant improvement in the quality of life of the majority of South Africans. But the rate of progress has slowed, certainly over the last 15 years. And I think that's leading to levels of frustration by the popularity of the ruling party. The ANC, that has been in power since 1994, is dwindling. They're at the risk of losing or failing to achieve a majority in next month's election. So I think, the challenges that South Africa face right now are very, very stark. Yes, there has been progress. South Africa is clearly an infinitely better place than it was in 1994, but the vision and the promise of the Constitution, we're a long way from fulfilling that.
Right, I want to talk about the upcoming election in more detail a little later in the show. But Kenneth, let's come to you right here in the studio. As we heard in that report from South Africa, South Africans of all colours have been given a voice. They've been given political freedom, but that freedom is not translated into a prosperous future for the majority of the country. As we heard from both of our guests, unemployment at record highs, especially among young people. The country has serious energy challenges. You have these rolling blackouts in the country. There are water shortages in places, and there's still extreme poverty across many parts of South Africa.
Correct.
The World Bank in 2022 said it was the most unequal country in the world. There was a lot of hope in 1994. Right. What happened?
I think, thanks a lot, Anand. What has, in my humble view, happened for South Africa is what we've seen in a number of African countries, post-colonial sort of era. What we call the ambivalence of the post-colonial state. In South Africa's case, is the ambivalence of the sort of post-apartheid state. Yeah. On the one hand, you've got a local governing class, which is sort of growing from those that have now taken over, trying to fit into the shoes of the predecessors. Right. So the shift from ideologically, from dealing with apartheid in terms of the race issues to social class issues, because, it can't always be about race. Like colonialism, it can't always be. At some point, you have to transition. I think the ruling party, ANC, has taken time to transition to deal with socio-economic issues. The focus has sort of been stuck onto the apartheid era. Now we've got white folks who are also poor on the streets, begging. I just flew from Cape Town. I was in Cape Town. I flew in 2 nights ago. So you can see that these are issues that other African countries have experienced. If only South Africa can pick lessons from other countries. And what happens often in these countries is that the ruling party, which comes to sort of ushers in independence and so forth, has a certain lifespan. After a certain period of time, you cannot sing the old song of apartheid or colonialism, because now it becomes the contemporary issues of social class across the board, across the aisle, white folks, Asian folks, colored folks. You got to take care of everybody.
Right, democracies do mature. Yeah. And, look, it's not a pretty picture. The country faces major challenges. But would you also agree, Kenneth, with our two previous panelists who said South Africa is in a better place today than it was in 1994?
The political space, definitely. We've about 350 political parties who've shown interest in these elections, which would not happen in the apartheid era. So the political space is there. People are free. And also you have independents who can participate now. The courts have ruled that an independent you don't have to belong to a party. So all these are new developments which, we can give credit to the current dispensation in South Africa that, things are moving in the right direction. The challenge, however, remains on the socio-economic indicators.
Right.
Yeah.
Nhlanhla, you are not quite part, you're a young South African, but you're not quite part of that born-free generation. That's what they call the people who were born after 1994. But you are, as I said, a young South African. You were born in the waning days of apartheid. As a young person in South Africa, what is your assessment of what the past 30 years have been like?
Anand, I'm quite glad that you highlight the fact that I was born pre-1994, to be specific with you, in 1998. So come 1994, the dawn of democracy, I was young, but being a young South African still growing up in this country, the frustration, especially among the youth, is quite palpable. When you speak to an average young person on the streets, they will tell you how they are frustrated by the growing unemployment rate in this country, especially affecting them, the youth. But it would seem that while there is a lot to celebrate when it comes to South Africa having achieved a political freedom, there are still calls for the country to achieve what's been dubbed this radical economic transformation, which of course is a concept that's been adopted by political parties, including the EFF, for instance, that use that saying as a banner and as part of their manifesto to say, if you vote for us, what we'll achieve for this country is true economic freedom. Because when you look at South Africa right now, the country is facing deep crisis when it comes to high unemployment rate, growing inequality, and also racial disparities that still rear their ugly head in this country. So there are calls to say that, look, while we may celebrate political freedom in this country, including a free press, there are still persistent calls for true economic emancipation, especially for the young people of this country.
Ambassador, South Africa is often held up as an example of what can happen when two sides sit down and negotiate, when they talk to each other, two adversaries negotiating with each other. It's held up as an example of reconciliation. The black population in South Africa was prepared to forgive those who had oppressed them for so many years, thanks to the leadership of people like Nelson Mandela, people like Archbishop Desmond Tutu. How great an achievement is that?
I think it is probably one of the best examples of human beings' finest angels coming to work. And many people who today may be disappointed and impatient with the rate of change would go back to that moment and second guess it and question it. What I would say is that our constitution has shown that what was negotiated in that early period was so durable, and people like Lawson, Naidoo, who's on our panel here, would say that it was that constitution that showed its mettle as it brought to book certain of the key people who derailed our transition, who used the opportunity to loot, and it was that constitution that proved durable because we had an activist judiciary, we had investigative press, and we had a very vibrant civil society, all of which came together to salvage South Africa's transition. So I would say we've stood the test of time, and there are many shortcomings that I think we have the opportunity to deal with because we remain free and we remain constitutional.
Lawson, to the ambassador's point about the South African constitution, I mean, it was a hard-won constitution. There were long negotiations to get to that constitution, but it is a resilient constitution, isn't it? I mean, South Africa has had, what, 6 elections, national elections, since 1994. It's been a peaceful transition, hasn't it?
Well, it's been a largely peaceful transition. We live in a very violent society. But it has been a peaceful transition. You know, it was called the miracle of 1994 because of the leadership of people like Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Tutu, who provided the shining light to lead us onto this path of negotiation and reconciliation. And, I think the Constitution has certainly stood us in good stead. We would have been in a much worse place had it not been for our Constitution, as Ambassador Rasool points out.
Yeah.
Without a strong independent judiciary, an independent media, and a very robust civil society that came to the fore and took up the cudgels where all organs of state failed. to do what was demanded of them by the Constitution, by the democratic norms and values that we now say that we are our own.
Right, and Lawson, to what extent can we attribute the issues facing South Africa right now to the legacy of apartheid? And I'm thinking of, certain sectors in South Africa, things like education, training in South Africa.
Well, I think on the one hand, one can't say that you're going to eradicate all of the vestiges of apartheid in the very short space of 30 years. I think that would be entirely unrealistic. So there are still remnants of the apartheid state that persist to this day. If we look at issues of spatial planning, we still live in very ghettoized communities to a large extent. So, that legacy is still there. But there has been progress, as I said earlier. But again, I stress the point that the progress that we should have made should have been much more far-reaching, much more enduring, and one can blame it on the economic situation. But that is also a product of choices that government has made with regards to how to prioritize expenditure, to prioritize a job creation. Fixing the education system, for example, is one of the things I think we've singularly failed to tackle from 1994, to tackle adequately. And we've wasted 30 years in fixing that education system, so we don't have the labor force with the skills that are necessary for a 21st century economy.
Right. Kenneth, on that question of the legacy of apartheid, there was a report that was published by the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. It was a scathing report when it looked at, what apartheid has left South Africa. It said that South Africa still grapples with its legacy: unequal access to education, unequal pay, segregated communities, and massive economic disparities. Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. Whenever there's change, if you use dialectics in philosophy, or those who subscribe to leftist views, like some of my colleagues in EFF, change from the old into the new carries over vestiges of the old.
That's the economic freedom fight.
Exactly. Yeah. Change from the old carries in vestiges into the new. So there are certain properties of the old that you find in the new. The new is not entirely a separate entity. So you do expect to see some of those things.
Right.
And we're only talking 30 years ago. It's not a long period of time. And also there was the issue of whether there's going to be radical transformation, change after 30 years. I mean, if you look at Southern Africa, the countries in Southern Africa, we have Angola, Mozambique, which were colonized by the Portuguese. And then the others, mostly Anglophone countries. The development strategies that these countries pursued after attaining independence were somewhat different. Angola, Mozambique, and I think Guinea-Bissau, which was another Portuguese, they pursued a radical transformation development strategy. Then Zambia and a few others like Tanzania pursued a reorganization, which is midway, not extremely radical. Then you had Kenya, Malawi, which pursued an accommodation development, basically adopting institutions that were set up by the colonialists. Now, we are 30 years past apartheid. The question is, which way are we going to go, or will we have a different, unique development strategy for South Africa?
Nhlanhla, do you get the sense that young South Africans think that there are better days ahead? I mean, what do you hear from the country's youth? Are they hopeful?
There's a mixed bag of emotion that's often expressed by young people in this country, where some are optimistic, having been able to access schemes such as the National Student Financial Aid Scheme for tertiary students, where basically the government would offer a loan to a young person, a poor young person, to gain access to higher education in this country. But even with that, there have been problems with the NSFAS schemes, where we hear at times that payments for allowances are not made on time. While we have received assurances from the body that is NSFAS, which caters for these young people, it's through examples like this where we see how frustrated youth are being made to feel, especially when it comes to systems which they deem to be inadequate, or corruption that stems from some of these bodies that we see. However, on the flip side, there is also a growing dissent amongst young people, where many are looking for an alternative, saying that, yes, we are post-apartheid right now, 30 years in, but still we are not seeing the true reflection of what this political freedom means, especially for me as a young person. As I'm sitting at home, I'm unemployed, I don't have access to education because I form part of what's been dubbed the missing middle, where, for instance, a parent would be seen as, a parent earning, let's say, 10,000 Rand, for instance, would be seen as not having been able to qualify to have their child access the scheme that I mentioned a bit earlier on, NSFAS, and being left to their own devices at times to find opportunities, whether it's in the form of entrepreneurship, for instance. But still, one will argue that for a young person to start a business in this country, that also requires money. And oftentimes they don't even have that money to start up these businesses. So there is a sense of frustration with many young people looking for an alternative, or some looking for a new political home to vote for.
Lawson, I want to get back to the elections which will take place in South Africa in just a few weeks. These are national elections. Some are calling it the most consequential election in South Africa after 1994. The ANC, which has been in government since 1994, could lose its majority. Its share of the vote could drop to under 50%. How do you see it?
Yes, it's certainly going to, it's turning out to be the most contested election since, in our democratic era. The possibility that the ANC's vote will slip below 50% is more than likely, one would say, at this point in time, because of the levels of frustration that exist across our society with the lack of progress that we've discussed. But the ANC will still remain the largest political party in South Africa by some distance. And so the likelihood is that the ANC will continue in power through some sort of coalition arrangement with the one or two other parties. But that depends on where the ANC vote ends up. Some people are saying that the vote could collapse. They could drop to 40%, which would make it, make some of the choices that the ANC faces a very difficult one. In that scenario, there would really only be two options open to the ANC, and that would be a coalition either with the official opposition, the Democratic Alliance, or with the radical economic freedom fighters that we've referenced earlier. And the latter, certainly scares off investors because of the so-called radical policies of the economic freedom fighters, including nationalization of the mines, the banks, land, and so on. And that may be a radical rhetoric, but those are not the kind of fixes that South Africa needs. So this election is a critical one, but the policy choices that face whatever government comes in post the election is going to be a critical one. And perhaps just a final point on the election, Anand. I think we've spoken a lot about young people, but what is particularly concerning is the huge numbers of young people who have not registered to vote in this election, and because they feel that they're on the margins of the society, that the government of the day does nothing for them, and their interest in participating is gone. And those pose serious challenges, not just in terms of this election, but for the future health of democracy in this country.
Nhlanhla, what has been your experience? I mean, what kind of engagement do you see among young people in South Africa? Are they going to vote? As Lawson says, many of them have not registered to vote. I mean, they're also eligible to stand for office, but what kind of outcome do you think there could be for young people?
Well, Anand, young people really aren't asking for too much. They're asking for solutions to the country's pressing problems, which is now made worse by the power crisis that the country, or electricity crisis that we are experiencing currently. So many of the young people I'm speaking with are saying that whilst they welcome the opportunities that have been presented in the advent of democracy, including being able to access what some dub as a free education at a basic education level, some also argue that, look, we want to be in a country that's stable, where we do see improvement in the tangible lives of many of our households, for instance, as many of these households, especially for poorer young people or people from vulnerable backgrounds, it doesn't seem to be improving. Many are saying that they've had to contend with poor housing, with the promise of being able to access RDP houses from their parents, for instance, who are still on the waiting list for the housing scheme, the government-sponsored housing scheme for over now. So many are contending with the notion to say, whilst we do see some slight improvement in the lives that are lived right now, the lived experience of especially vulnerable Black South Africans.
Yeah.
We do want to see this radical economic transformation, and we want to hear what political parties have to bring to the table insofar as answering pertinent questions that are being asked by young people as to how are we going to respond to the housing crisis, the unemployment crisis as well, but also how is the country going to create or grow the economy in such a way which will create better opportunities for them, even better job opportunities for them as well.
Kenneth, it will be a huge challenge to close the economic gap in South Africa. I mean, we are hearing a lot of promises being made right now, but of course, it's election time, it's election speak, it's campaign talk. But do you think this election could mark a turning point for South Africa?
Definitely. There are a number of factors to consider. If ANC does not return an outright majority in the National Assembly, where the president is chosen, it would mean probably it will go for a coalition. And that might not sit comfortably well with ANC to get the person they want to lead the nation. And that could also spill over into international relations and foreign policy, the position of South Africa in the international community, whoever comes into power, and his vision as a leader at the international level. At the domestic level, of course, there are challenges. We're talking of job creation, there's unemployment, crime, and so forth. These have been highlighted. These have to be addressed as well. So, and that is why I said, you know, the sort of the ambivalence of the post-apartheid state. On the one hand, you have to deal with international relations. On the other hand, domestic policy. So the way it's going to turn out when they go to the votes, I think it will be a challenge for ANC. And I don't think that it's unusual, like I said, for most political parties after an estimation of 15, 20, 30 years after independence. You know, people begin to get tired of the old song of independence. You got to have a new song to tell them.
Okay, and that is where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Naidoo in Washington, D.C.
I see a country on the move,